For 12 years, they forgot to invite me to Christmas. Then I bought a mountain resort, and suddenly I was family again. My mom called it home. My dad called it his. My brother called the movers. I called my lawyer. One court order later, the silence they gave me became the one thing they couldn't escape. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, yet don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The city glowed like a snow globe that night. Portland in December. All reflections and silence. I sat by the window of my apartment overlooking the Willamette River, watching Christmas lights ripple across the dark water. Somewhere families were gathering around fireplaces, exchanging gifts, laughing. My phone stayed still on the counter. It had been still for 12 years. 12 years without a single invitation home. Every December, my parents sent the world the same kind of photo. Our family framed in matching sweaters, the tree glittering behind them. The caption, something about gratitude and togetherness. My mother always tagged me in the post, though I wasn't in the picture. I suppose it made the absence look intentional. A career woman. Too busy. Too independent. I leaned my head against the glass and the cold pressed back. They said I was too outstanding for their image, I whispered. Maybe they were right. Maybe light does make them squint. I can trace it back to the first year they decided I didn't belong. It was 2012. I'd just won an award for a national ad campaign, my first real recognition. That night, I drove out to their house in Lake Oswego, thinking maybe they'd be proud. Dinner was elegant as always, linen napkins, roasted duck, a centerpiece of white roses that smelled faintly of control. My father, Gregory, poured the wine. My mother, Eleanor, smiled thinly as I told them about the ceremony, about standing on that stage, under a wash of light. My brother Nathan raised his glass halfway, already checking his phone. "That's wonderful, dear," my mother said, finally, slicing her duck with surgical precision. "But be careful. People might think our family is showing off." Her tone wasn't angry. It was colder than that, measured polite finale. My father cleared his throat and said, "Speaking of success, Nathan's been offered a partnership at his firm. We're so proud." The conversation shifted neatly away from me like a tablecloth pulled from under a set of dishes without a sound. I remember smiling. I remember the taste of the wine. Too dry like swallowing sand. That was the last Christmas I was officially invited home. The years after that were quieter. Each December came with the same pattern. A text from my mother, always late, always gentle. "Oh, sweetheart, we thought you had plans in the city." Or, "We decided last minute to keep things simple this year." My father would add a thumbs up emoji. Nathan might post a photo captioned family time. I learned not to reply. 2015 was the year I stopped waiting. I booked a last-minute trip to Seattle, stayed in a boutique hotel that smelled of cedar and coffee. I bought myself dinner on Christmas Eve, watched the lights from Pike Place through the rain. It was lonely, yes, but at least it was mine. By 2019, the ritual had turned absurd. A holiday card arrived at my apartment, glossy and perfect. The Whitmores, Gregory, Eleanor, Nathan, Lydia, smiling by the fireplace. Underneath, in neat cursive, someone had written, "Season's greetings." My name was printed at the bottom of the mailing label and crossed out with a blue pen. The kind of mistake that isn't a mistake at all. I stared at it for a long time. Then I laughed. The sound startled me. It echoed too loudly in the empty kitchen. I dropped the card into the recycling bin, poured myself another glass of wine, and promised that next year I wouldn't even notice. Now, sitting here 12 years later, I realized I'd kept that promise. Mostly. The city's lights shimmered through the glass, each reflection a quiet version of itself. I reached for my laptop and closed it gently, as if to tuck the night in. Behind me, the hum of the heater filled the silence like breathing. The apartment was minimalist by design, hardwood floors, concrete walls, glass everywhere. I chose it because it looked nothing like home. No family portraits, no clutter of inherited things, just my own taste, my own space. The clock on the stove blinked 11:58. I turned off the lamp and stood at the window again. On the far bank, someone set off early fireworks. The faint pops echoed across the river, fading before they reached me. The email notification came through at midnight, a sharp sound in the quiet. I glanced at the screen. North Coast Branding Year-End Performance Bonus Confirmation. I clicked it open. Outstanding Performance Award, 120,000. The words glowed against the darkness. For a moment I just stared. 12 years ago, outstanding was what made me uninvited. Now it was the reason I was celebrated. I let out a slow breath, something between relief and disbelief. The river below shimmered under the streetlights, endless and still. I pressed my hand to the window, felt the cold through the glass. Somewhere my family was probably raising a toast, laughing about something safe. They wouldn't be thinking of me. That was fine. I wasn't thinking of them either. Not really. I was thinking about silence, about what it feels like when it finally stops hurting and starts sounding like peace. The heater clicked off. The apartment fell into a deeper quiet. I turned away from the window, closed my laptop, and let the darkness settle around me. Tomorrow would be just another day, but for the first time in years, it would be mine. Monday mornings always had that sterile kind of brightness, the kind that made everything look cleaner than it really was. The glass walls of North Coast branding glowed with Pacific light, a reflection of success carefully staged. I stood at the front of the conference room, clicker in hand, the final slide of my presentation glowing behind me. Find your signal. Our campaign isn't about conquering nature, I said, scanning the faces of executives from Trailmark Outdoor. It's about finding the stillness that makes people feel alive. Clarity sells better than adrenaline. They nodded in that synchronized way corporate people do when they smell a win. I saw my own reflection in the glass. Tailored blazer hair pinned just right, not a single piece of me out of place. I'd learned long ago how to make order look effortless. Mr. Barrett, the CEO, leaned back in his chair. You always nail the emotional core, Clara. You understand what it means to feel lost out there. He smiled. Maybe because you've been there. The room chuckled lightly. I smiled back, professional polished. Inside, something small flickered, a memory of being lost but not outdoors. The meeting broke with handshakes and promises of bonuses. The younger creatives whispered legend as I walked out. I pushed through the glass doors down to the cafe below the building. The espresso machine hissed the air thick with roasted beans and ambition. I sat by the window, stirred sugar into my coffee, and watched people rush across the street, each carrying a story they'd never tell. I build images for other people, I thought. But mine was erased long before I ever learned to hold a camera steady. Steam rose from the cup, blurring my reflection in the glass. The sound of Christmas music played faintly from the speakers, some cheerful tune about home. I almost laughed. The memory came uninvited. It was 2005. I was 17, standing in our backyard in Lake Oswego, while a photographer arranged us for the annual Whitmore family Christmas card. The air smelled like pine and perfume. My mother fussed over everyone's collars, smoothing Nathan's tie, brushing invisible lint from my father's sleeve. When she got to me, she paused, eyes narrowing, as if trying to solve a visual problem. Clara stepped to the left, she said. The photographer, a kind man with a lanyard around his neck, frowned at the frame. Actually, ma'am, she balances the shot better next to her brother. Same height. My mother's smile froze. No Nathan should be in the center. Clara can stand near the edge. It'll look cleaner. I remember the flash going off. The smile on my face didn't reach my eyes. That photo would hang in their hallway for years. Nathan's arm around Mom, Dad behind them, me off to the side half lit. Compositionally perfect, emotionally vacant. The sound of a phone buzzing snapped me back to the cafe. I blinked, the past dissolving like foam on top of my coffee. A new email notification slid across the screen. From Eleanor Hayes. Subject: Find your signal. I frowned, surprised. I'd read about her. A major investor in sustainable travel and eco-design known for turning forgotten mountain towns into luxury retreats. I opened the email. I just saw your campaign, it read. You understand something most people miss. The power of quiet. I have a project I'd like to discuss with you. Let's meet. I stared at her words. The power of quiet. For a long time, silence had been punishment. In my house, silence was how you were reminded of your place. It was withheld warmth, a lesson disguised as peace. But maybe now silence was something else. Something I could claim. I scrolled back up, rereading the line. I have a project I'd like to discuss. Outside, the winter sun broke through a stretch of gray cloud, bouncing off the cafe window and landing on my coffee cup. I traced the rim of it with my finger, the metal of my ring cold against my skin. Maybe it was ridiculous to feel that spark again, the kind that usually ends in disappointment, but something in that message felt different, like a door I hadn't known was still locked, had quietly opened. I typed a short reply. Ms. Hayes, I'd be honored to meet. I believe we understand the same kind of silence. I hit send before I could second guess it. A barista set down a new pastry on the counter, powdered sugar drifting into the air like faint snow. I finished my coffee, slipped on my coat, and stepped outside. The cold bit at my cheeks, but it woke me up in the best way. Downtown Portland in December always looked slightly melancholy, the kind of beauty that doesn't try too hard. I walked along the street, phone in my pocket, a small buzz of purpose humming under my ribs. Maybe silence wasn't what they said it was. Maybe it wasn't emptiness at all. Maybe it was space. Space to build something new, something that belonged entirely to me. By the time I reached the corner, the sky had shifted to a dull silver, the color of beginning. I stopped, opened my contacts and saved a new name. Eleanor Hayes. For the first time in a long while, I felt something stir that wasn't bitterness or pride. It was possibility. I looked up at the cloudy sky, my breath a thin mist. Silence used to mean being forgotten. Now it sounded like an invitation. The road curved higher into the Cascades, where the world turned white and soundless. My car engine hummed against the silence, tires crunching over snow that had fallen overnight. Pines crowded the road, their branches heavy and glistening. The radio played low, an old acoustic song I couldn't name, and for the first time in years, I felt the pull of a direction that was mine. I was driving east, away from Portland, away from the city's noise and its glass towers, away from everything that had ever required me to shrink to fit. I didn't know what I'd find in High Ridge, only that something inside me had decided this was where my life would start to make sense again. The sign appeared after a long stretch of winding forest road, High Ridge, population 4108. A handful of buildings nestled at the base of the mountains, smoke rising from their chimneys. It looked like a postcard someone had forgotten to send. I parked in front of a small cafe called Timberline Coffee. The bell above the door jingled when I stepped inside. It smelled like waffles and cinnamon warmth thick enough to breathe. A man behind the counter waved. "You must be Clara," he said, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Tom Jenkins," we talked on the phone. He was in his 40s with a weathered face and the kind of steady eyes that belong to people who don't rush. He spread out a topographical map on the counter while the waitress poured me coffee. "This," he said, tracing a square of land near a creek bend, "is 3.5 acres on the east slope. Used to be a campground in the 70s. Abandoned after a fire scare. Nothing major, just rumors. It's been sitting empty since. The estate's ready to sell." I studied the map. A narrow road wound up from the town, then disappeared into forest. "How much?" "400,000, he said. "Steep, but the view is worth it. You'll see." The snow started falling again while we drove up in his truck. The higher we climbed, the quieter it got. Pines rose like dark spires, snowflakes swirling through the branches. When the truck stopped, there was nothing but air and white space. Tom got out first, crunching through the snow. "Here she is," he said, sweeping a hand toward the ridge. I followed, boots sinking into the powder. The ground sloped gently upward to a clearing that overlooked a wide valley. The sun broke through the clouds just then, lighting the snow so bright it hurt to look. I stood there, breath visible in the cold, and felt the kind of silence that doesn't demand anything, the kind that accepts you just for being still. I walked to a pine tree at the edge of the clearing and placed my hand on its trunk. The bark was rough cold under my palm. I could smell sap and frost, something clean, something untouched. For so long, I'd believed belonging had to be granted, that you needed someone's permission to stand in a certain place to call it yours. But maybe belonging was just this finding somewhere that didn't argue with your existence. Tom's voice broke the quiet. "Hard to believe this place sat empty so long." "It was waiting," I said softly. He smiled, uncertain if I was joking. "You want me to contact the seller?" "Yes," I said. "Let's do it." We drove back to town through the falling snow. Inside the cafe, Tom connected me with the property attorney handling the sale. I filled out the forms, my name steady on every line, Clara Whitmore, managing member Silverpine Retreat, LLC. The words looked strange together, official, permanent, but they fit. When the papers were done, Tom shook my hand. "Congratulations. You just bought a mountain. I laughed, but something about it felt true. Outside, the snow had turned to flurries, dusting the windshield as I unlocked my car. On impulse, I took out my phone and texted my grandmother. Just bought a piece of a mountain, Nana. The phone rang seconds later. Her voice, faint but bright as ever, filled the car. You really did it, kiddo, I did. There was a pause, then the soft clink of her teacup against a saucer. When you start building, make sure you leave room for the light. Don't wall yourself in. Even strong walls need windows. I smiled, eyes on the ridgeline in the distance. I'll build a place quiet enough for both of us. I believe you will, she said. I always knew you'd find your own way up the mountain. The call ended, and for a long moment I just sat there. The car idling, the snow melting in tiny rivers down the glass. The map from Tom lay open on the passenger seat. I traced the thin black line leading to the property, mine now, my own coordinates on the world's grid. I started the drive back to Portland as daylight faded headlights cutting through the gray. The radio played another quiet song, something wordless. At the edge of town, I passed the sign again. Welcome to High Ridge. The snow was easing now, patches of earth showing through. I caught my reflection in the side window. Steady alert, something new behind the eyes. I thought of the house I'd build there someday, the sound of wind through the pines, the smell of firewood, a place no one could tell me I didn't belong. The last of the sunlight slipped behind the ridge, and the valley below turned gold, then blue. As I merged onto the highway, I whispered to no one but myself, "It's a beginning." And for the first time in a long time, the word didn't sound fragile. It sounded real. The sound of saws and hammers filled the morning air, sharp and rhythmic against the wind. The cold in the Cascades had its own voice, one that whistled through unfinished walls and made the wooden frames groan. I stood on the half-frozen ground of what would soon be Silver Pine Retreat, the smell of sawdust and pine mingling like something old and new colliding. Building a house is easier than rebuilding trust. At least wood doesn't lie. It bends, it breaks, but it never pretends. I adjusted the hood of my coat and studied the blueprint in my hands. Lines and numbers, beams and joists. It looked fragile on paper, but I could already feel its weight in my bones. A black SUV rolled up the narrow access road. The tires hissed on the icy gravel. From it stepped Eleanor Hayes, every inch the kind of woman who didn't belong in a construction site, but made everyone believe she did. Beige trench coat, dark sunglasses, a scarf knotted neatly at her throat. She waved to me as if we were meeting at a boardroom, not a ridge. You weren't kidding, she said, her boots crunching toward me. You picked a location with a view worth freezing for. I smiled. You get used to the cold. She took the blueprints from my hands, eyes scanning the design. Minimalist, clean, feels grounded. But tell me, Clara, why not use your family name for the resort? Whitmore sounds established, historic. Silverpine feels transitional. The wind caught the edge of the paper between us, and I held it steady. Silverpine is the name I chose, I said evenly, not the one I inherited. I don't need their name on this place. This isn't legacy. It's a beginning. Eleanor looked at me over the rim of her sunglasses, considering, You're a very particular woman, Clara. I've earned the right to be. She smiled faintly, a flash of recognition, maybe admiration, maybe warning. All right, Silverpine it is. Just make sure it stands for something more than survival. People will want to know why you built it. They can come find out, I said. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of steel. Workers hammered in the last beam of the day, their voices echoing faintly in the crisp air. I helped one of them steady the plank that would frame the front of the main lodge. When it locked into place, I lifted the small wooden sign I'd carved myself. Silverpine Retreat, and nailed it into the post. The sound rang through the valley like a declaration. For a moment, everyone went quiet, looking up at the sign as if it meant something. Maybe it did. I stood there, breath fogging in the cold, and thought of how every blow of the hammer felt like erasing a line between who I was and who they made me feel like I had to be. By sunset, the workers packed up headlights winding down the hill. The world turned orange and then blue. When the last truck disappeared, the silence rushed in. Thick, clean, full of space. Headlights appeared again just as I was locking the shed. A familiar silver SUV crawled up the road. and I smiled before it even stopped. Priya and Gabe climbed out bundled in coats, their laughter cutting through the cold like something alive. "You weren't kidding about the middle of nowhere," Priya said, pulling her scarf tighter. "That's the point," I said. They brought bags of groceries, a portable speaker, and 2 bottles of cheap wine. We set up dinner inside the unfinished lodge, just a camp stove, folding chairs, and the soft glow of a single hanging bulb. Gabe opened a pack of noodles while Priya lit candles in glass jars. It smelled like garlic wood and freedom. "This place is insane," Gabe said between mouthfuls. "You're going to turn it into a luxury fortress. You could charge $500 a night easy." Or, Priya said, grinning, she could just live here and never invite anyone. "That would be the real luxury." I laughed. "That's the plan." Priya leaned back in her chair. "So, be honest. Will you invite your family up when it's done?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. I looked at the candle flame flickering with the draft that slipped through the unfinished walls. "They'll come when they smell success," I said finally. "They always do. My family's great at pretending love is just another form of ownership." Priya reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Gabe looked away, sensing something fragile there. We didn't say anything else about it. After dinner, Gabe played an old song on his phone, something slow and nostalgic. We sat in the warmth of the small fire we'd built in the portable pit, our shadows dancing against raw wooden walls. When they finally fell asleep in their sleeping bags, I stepped outside. The air was sharp and still. Snow fell lightly, dusting the planks and half-built beams in white. The work lights glowed faintly across the sight halos in the dark. I stood there, breath rising, heart steady. The ridge below was swallowed by night. From up here, the world looked empty and infinite. I wasn't sure if I was building a home or a barricade. Maybe both. The hammer still lay where I'd left it earlier, half buried in snow. I picked it up, brushed it clean, and drove one more nail into the post of the new fence, just because I could. The sound cracked through the cold air, echoing off the trees. I smiled. Tomorrow the walls would go higher. The roof would start to take shape. The idea would turn solid, one board at a time. But for tonight, it was enough to stand here in the quiet, my breath fogging against the dark, knowing that every inch of this place was built on something that finally belonged to me. The first light of morning spilled through the tall glass wall of the main lodge, catching the steam rising from my mug. The air smelled of pine and fresh paint. Outside, the ridge glowed pale gold under a thin layer of frost. The workers were gone for the weekend, the silence too perfect to waste. I poured myself another cup of coffee, stood barefoot on the new wooden floor, and took 3 photos. The first, sunrise cutting through the mist above the valley. The second, my hand around the mug light flaring across the rim. The third, the mountain itself, half veiled in silver fog, the reflection of the lodge just visible in the window. I uploaded them to my private Instagram, caption, "Bought myself a quiet place." It felt simple, harmless. I set the phone aside and watched the mist roll off the slope like smoke from an invisible fire. By afternoon, the phone wouldn't stop vibrating. I was sanding one of the porch railings when it buzzed again and again until I finally wiped my hands and picked it up. Dozens of notifications, mentions, comments, and one name that froze me in place. Eleanor Whitmore tagged you in a post. The family group chat, the one I'd muted for years, suddenly reappeared, revived from digital death. Whitmore updates. I opened it. At the top was my photo, the one I'd posted that morning. The mountain, the fog, the caption. Only now it had a new one above it, written by my mother. Exciting news. Nathan and Lydia will be moving into Silverpine for the winter. The perfect place for family holidays. A string of emojis followed snowflakes. A Christmas tree. A red heart. Beneath it, replies poured in from relatives I hadn't spoken to in a decade. How wonderful. What a beautiful family getaway. So proud of you all. Then came my father's text, brief and dry. As ever. Legally, I can assist with the documentation and property tax paperwork. Don't worry yourself about logistics. And then Nathan, my brother, the golden child who never had to ask for permission. He sent a photo of a moving truck, the caption scrawled across the image. "We're coming home." I stared at the screen until the light from it blurred. My hands trembled slightly, though my face didn't move. My reflection in the glass door looked calm, almost detached. They hadn't forgotten me. They'd just been waiting until I owned something worth remembering. I scrolled back to the top of the chat. My mother's caption looked celebratory, even benevolent. A public declaration of generosity. As if this place I'd built with every hour, every splinter, every breath of my own solitude was now a family heirloom waiting to be inherited. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. Years of training told me to stay polite, stay measured. But there was no room left for diplomacy. I typed no, not allowed. 3 words. I hit send. The typing bubble appeared almost immediately, then vanished. 2 minutes later, my phone lit up with a call from Dad. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello, Dad. Clara." His voice was smooth, measured the tone he used in board meetings. "I just saw your message to your mother. I assume you didn't mean it quite so abruptly. I meant it exactly as written." A pause. I could hear the faint hum of his office behind him, the clicking of a pen, the low buzz of distant conversation. "You don't want to make things difficult for the family, do you?" There it was, the subtle warning wrapped in paternal care. "I'm not making things difficult," I said steady. "I'm making them clear." He exhaled slowly, a sound of quiet disbelief. "Your mother's been very emotional. She's already arranging Christmas plans. Nathan and Lydia are packing. They'll arrive Friday." "They won't," I said. "Clara," he said, again sharper now. "You're overreacting. We're talking about family, not strangers." I looked out through the window. Snow had started again, flakes swirling like ash in the wind. The mountains looked endless, immovable. "That's exactly the problem," I said. "Family thinks they own whatever they can touch." He was silent for a long time. Then, in that clipped professional tone that had ended every argument since I was a child, he said, "You can't keep us out. You'll regret it if you try." "No," I said quietly. "I'll regret it if I let you in." And then I hung up. For a moment, I didn't move. The house felt too still, the kind of silence that presses against your ribs. My pulse was loud in my ears, but my breathing stayed even. I opened my contacts, blocked his number, then my mother's, then Nathan's, one by one. I opened the family group chat. The line of text glowed at the bottom, my last message. "No, not allowed." I tapped leave group. The screen went blank. The vibration stopped. I set the phone face down on the table. Outside, the snow thickened, covering the porch, the railings, the footprints from earlier that morning. The mountain looked untouched again, as if no one had ever tried to claim it. I sat by the window, the mug of cold coffee still on the counter, and let the silence fill the space they'd tried to invade. Sometimes, the only way to answer is to say nothing at all. The wind howled briefly against the glass, then faded into stillness. I watched the snow drift, and thought about how quiet strength looks nothing like defiance. It looks like peace. The drive to Bend was long and silent, the kind of silence that carried its own gravity. The highway stretched out between frozen fields and dark pine forests, and every mile felt like a line being drawn in ink. When I finally pulled up outside Sable Winter's office, the sky was the color of slate low clouds pressing down on the Cascade foothills. The office sat above a high-end outdoor gear shop tucked into a row of minimalist buildings. Inside it smelled faintly of paper and cold air. The walls were gray, the light sterile. Sable Winters looked exactly like her name. Sharp, precise, no wasted motion. She rose from behind her desk as I entered. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I understand your family is making some creative assumptions about property ownership." I sat down, setting my phone on the desk, the screen already open to the messages and screenshots. I'd collected my mother's post, my father's texts, Nathan's photo of the moving truck. Beside it, I placed a folder of documents. The deed, the LLC registration, the purchase agreement. Sable adjusted her glasses, scanning everything in silence. When she spoke, her voice was even and cool. "You were smart to create Silverpine as an LLC. That gives us distance. What we're going to do now is make that distance legally unbridgeable." She pulled a crisp white form from her drawer and set it in front of me. "This is a no trespass order. We'll file it with the county sheriff. Once recorded, it establishes that any entry onto your property by these individuals is a criminal offense, not a family dispute." She uncapped a black pen and wrote 3 names in neat block letters: Gregory Whitmore, Eleanor Whitmore, Nathan Whitmore. Seeing them there, on paper under a heading that read, Prohibited Parties, felt unreal. Sable glanced up. Do you understand what this means? I nodded. It means, if they come to my property, I call the police. It means, she corrected, you don't open the door. You don't engage. You call and say there are trespassers on your land. Don't use the word family. Not once. The law doesn't recognize sentiment. I let out a slow breath. That won't be a problem. The pen clicked as she handed it to me. I signed where she pointed, the tip scratched across the paper dry and final. The overhead lights reflected off the smooth surface, turning the black ink into something metallic. They taught me silence was obedience, I said quietly, half to myself. Turns out, silence can be a legally binding document. Sable didn't smile, but her eyes flickered with a kind of respect. That's one way to look at it. She slid the signed order into a folder. We'll have it filed by tomorrow. You'll receive a certified copy for your records. When I stood to leave, she added, You did the right thing, Clara. Control the narrative before they do. Don't let emotion undo the boundaries you've set. I nodded, pocketed my phone, and walked out into the freezing wind. The drive back to Silverpine felt shorter, maybe because my mind was sharper. The resort came into view as dusk settled. The main lodge, the unfinished cabins, the steel-gray outline of the ridge beyond. My breath fogged in the cold when I stepped out of the car. Inside, the air smelled faintly of new wood and varnish. I pulled the printed private property, Silverpine LLC sign from the back seat, and screwed it onto the post by the front gate. The metal bit into the wood with a satisfying grind. Then I went to work reinforcing the rest. I installed the new lock code on the front door, changing the access digits to something even I had to double-check. The keypad light blinked green, then went dark. Next, I unboxed the new security cameras, sleek black domes with motion sensors. I mounted one by the driveway, another above the front porch, a third, inside, facing the glass wall overlooking the valley. When they powered on, a faint red dot appeared in each lens. Watching, recording. By the time I finished, night had fallen. The only light came from the lantern on the table and the dull glow of the security monitor. I sank into the chair by the window and watched the live feed. The image flickered between the driveway, the porch, the forest beyond. Nothing moved but the wind. Outside, the snow began again, soft, steady, endless. This wasn't a fortress. It was a declaration. The fire crackled in the corner, warm against the glass's cold reflection. My reflection looked unfamiliar. Tired, yes, but steady. Resolved. The silence of the mountain had changed. It no longer sounded like isolation. It sounded like ownership. I took a sip of tea and set the mug down carefully, the ceramic clinking against the wood. Then faintly under the wind I heard it, distant, low, like tires on gravel. I turned to the monitor. Headlights flared briefly on the far edge of the driveway camera, then blinked out. I held my breath, waiting. The forest outside was still. No movement. Probably nothing, I told myself. Probably just someone passing through. But my heart was already beating faster. I turned up the monitor's brightness. The feed showed only falling snow. The motion alert icon flashed once, then went dark again. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the screen, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The night pressed in thick and heavy. No more calls, no more texts. No more voices trying to lay claim to what they never built. The mountain was mine now, and it was listening. The snow had been falling for hours, thick and heavy, turning the ridge into a white, silent world. Inside Silverpine, the fire burned low, painting the glass walls in soft orange. I was curled on the sofa with a book I wasn't really reading. A mug of peppermint tea warming my hands. It was the kind of night that made the whole world feel distant, contained, safe. Then the alarm went off. A sharp electronic chime sliced through the quiet. My book slipped from my lap. I turned to the security monitor on the table beside me. The porch camera showed a wash of white snow and then headlights. Bright beams cutting through the storm. A black SUV crawled up the driveway tires, crunching on the frozen gravel. I froze. The timestamp in the corner read 11:42 p.m. The engine idled, then cut. 4 doors opened in sequence. My father Gregory stepped out first, wearing a heavy overcoat and that same calm expression he wore during negotiations. Behind him came my mother, Eleanor, wrapped in fur, her hair a halo of silver against the night. Nathan followed, tall, confident, dragging a suitcase through the snow. Lydia, his wife, trailed after him, rubbing her arms for warmth. And then there was the 5th man. He was older, stocky, carrying a metal toolbox. A locksmith. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. I tapped the screen to zoom in. My father pointed toward the front door, his lips moving sharply. The locksmith nodded and knelt, pulling out a drill. The knock on the glass was like a gunshot. "Open the door." Clara Gregory's voice boomed, muffled but clear. "This is ridiculous. We're family. This is the Whitmore home." The irony struck me in the chest. The same man who hadn't invited me home in 12 years was now pounding on my door to claim the one I'd built myself. I didn't move. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up my phone and unlocked it. The emergency contact at the top read, "Sheriff's Office, High Ridge County." The dispatcher answered on the second ring. "This is High Ridge County Dispatch. What's your emergency?" "My name is Clara Whitmore." I said, my voice calm but shaking at the edges. "I'm the managing member of Silver Pine Retreat, LLC, located off Kestrel Ridge Road. I have an active no trespass order on file against Gregory Eleanor and Nathan Whitmore. They're on my porch right now. They've brought a locksmith and are attempting to break my front lock." The dispatcher's tone changed instantly. "Are you in a safe location, ma'am?" "Yes, I'm inside with all doors secured. Units are en route. Stay on the line. Do not engage." Outside, the sound of the drill bit into the night. I watched it all through the monitor. The locksmith leaning forward, my father pacing, my mother calling something I couldn't hear. Lydia stood near the car, pale and motionless. Nathan kicked at the snow like a frustrated child. The drill whined louder, then stopped. My reinforced lock didn't give. My father barked something, impatient, furious, and the locksmith shook his head. That's when the siren echoed through the trees. A faint wail at first, then growing louder, bouncing off the ridge. The headlights of the patrol car washed over the SUV. Red and blue lights strobed across the snow, cutting through the darkness like judgment. My family froze. 2 deputies stepped out, flashlights in hand, their boots sinking into the snow. The older one approached first, his expression neutral, but firm. "Evening, folks," he said. "We got a call about a possible break-in attempt." My father straightened. "There's no break-in. This is a family misunderstanding. My daughter's inside. She's confused." The deputy raised an eyebrow. "That's so." He held up a clipboard, reading from it. "You, Gregory Whitmore?" "Yes." He moved down the list. "Eleanor Whitmore." My mother nodded, her chin trembling. "Nathan Whitmore." "Yeah," Nathan muttered. The deputy nodded once, then folded the paper neatly. "All 3 of you are named in an active no trespass order filed with the county 2 weeks ago. You are not permitted on this property. Any attempt to enter constitutes criminal trespass." Eleanor stepped forward, voice breaking. "That's my daughter." "You can't possibly mean—" "I mean exactly that, ma'am," the deputy said evenly. "Under Oregon law, family relations don't exempt anyone from private property restrictions." My mother's face crumpled. Nathan swore under his breath. My father's jaw tightened, his voice dropping to that tone he used when he wanted to sound rational. "Officer, you don't understand. This property belongs to our family. My daughter's acting emotionally. We just came to resolve things." The deputy's flashlight swung toward the locksmith. "Sir, you with them?" The man nodded nervously. "They said it was their place. I was just doing a job." "Pack it up and leave," the deputy said. "Now." The locksmith didn't hesitate. He shoved his drill into the toolbox, muttered an apology, and hurried to his van. The second deputy stepped closer to my father. "Sir, I'm going to ask you and your family to get back in your vehicle. If you refuse, you'll be arrested." For a moment, Gregory didn't move. Snow gathered on his shoulders, catching in his gray hair. The wind howled softly through the trees. Then finally he turned and walked toward the SUV. My mother followed, stumbling slightly in her heels. Nathan threw one last glare toward the house before slamming the back door shut. The deputy waited until their headlights disappeared down the road before knocking gently on my door. "Ms. Whitmore." I opened it an inch, the safety chain still locked. "Yes." He tipped his hat. "They're gone. I'll file the incident report tonight. You did the right thing calling it in. Thank you, I said. My voice sounded distant even to me. When the patrol car drove away, its red and blue lights faded into the snow until only darkness remained. I stood at the window for a long time, staring out at the empty driveway. The wind had already begun to erase their footprints. They'd expected me to open the door out of guilt, out of habit, out of the old reflex to make peace at my own expense. But the door had stayed closed, locked by law. The fire crackled again, soft and steady. And I sat back down on the couch, the book still open to the same unread page. The mountain outside was quiet, once more blanketed in white. For the first time, the silence felt like safety. The morning light came soft and silver, spilling over the snow-covered ridge like silk. Every surface of Silverpine gleamed. The railings, the pines, the glass wall that turned the valley into a living painting. The storm had passed overnight, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean. I was up early, barefoot on the warm floor, whisking eggs while cinnamon filled the air. The kitchen smelled like safety. Outside smoke curled from the chimney, the only movement in a landscape of white. By the time Priya and Gabe arrived, the house was alive. Music hummed from the speakers, the smell of coffee drifted through the open room, and for once, laughter didn't echo off emptiness. It stayed, it rooted. Sarah and Tom from down the ridge had come too, carrying a tray of cinnamon rolls so thick with icing it looked like snow. Tom hung his coat by the door. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, grinning. "Feels like we walked into a postcard." Sarah's eyes softened as she looked around the room, her hands clasped around a steaming mug. "You know she said this might be the first Christmas where you're actually home." I smiled, quiet but real. "Yeah," I said. "It might be." We sat together around the table I'd sanded and stained myself. The fire popped behind us, the windows fogged with heat. We ate too much, talked too loudly. Priya told stories from college, Gabe argued with Tom about which Christmas movie was objectively terrible. For a while, it was just warmth. Family, I thought, wasn't who remembered your birthday. It was who showed up when no one else did. It wasn't about blood. It was about proximity, who chose to stand beside you when things turned cold. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when Priya's phone buzzed. She frowned, glanced at it, and then looked at me with the same expression she used when she knew something I wouldn't like. "Clara," she said carefully, "you might want to see this." She slid the phone across the table. The screen showed a Facebook post, public and polished, my mother's profile picture, the one where she wore pearls, and that carefully trained smile. Feeling grateful this Christmas, the caption began, "Nathan and Lydia have found the perfect place to start their family, Silverpine Retreat." A true Whitmore legacy. We couldn't be prouder. Below it was a collage of photos Nathan and Lydia standing in front of the family home in Lake Oswego, an image of mountains that looked suspiciously like mine pulled from the internet and, of course, my own photo, the one from Instagram, cropped, reposted, legacy. I said, my voice flat. Priya hesitated. "Clara." I laughed once, sharp and low. They didn't even bother to change the caption format. She wrote it like a press release. Gabe leaned forward, scrolling. "They're not just posting. Look at the comments. They're framing this like a family project. People think Nathan owns the place. They're building a narrative making you the outlier again. It's a PR play." "I know that tactic," I said, standing. The room suddenly felt smaller. I used to build campaigns like this. Emotion, first, facts later. They're not coming for my walls this time. They're coming for perception. Sarah looked worried. "Can they do that? Legally?" I exhaled, watching the frost gather on the inside of the glass. Legally, no, but publicly. They can say whatever they want, and people will believe it because it sounds nice. I walked to the window, my reflection hovering over the view of the ridge. The snow was falling again, soft and relentless. For 12 years they had erased me quietly. Now they wanted to write me out of my own story entirely. Behind me, Gabe said, "They're laying groundwork. Whitmore legacy. They'll use that to justify a claim later, probably to investors or the press." Priya's phone buzzed again. She checked it, her eyebrows knitting together. Okay, this might get worse." She turned the screen so I could see a new message thread. A reporter's name I recognized from Portland Business Daily. "Hey, Priya isn't your friend Clara, the one who started Silverpine Retreat. We're hearing the Whitmore family is in talks to sell partial ownership to a private fund. Can she confirm? I stared at the words until they blurred. Sell partial ownership, I repeated softly. Tom blinked. How could they? They don't own a damn inch of this land. They don't have to. I said, they just have to make someone think they do. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering the snow from the pines. The valley disappeared behind a curtain of white. I picked up my phone from the counter. The lock screen still showed the mountain from that morning months ago. The day I first saw this land and decided it would be mine. The image felt like another lifetime. For a moment, I considered calling my father just to hear what excuse they'd invented this time. But no, that would give them what they wanted: engagement, reaction, a crack to step through. Instead, I took a breath and turned back to my friends. Enjoy breakfast, I said softly. I need to make a few calls. Priya opened her mouth to protest, but I was already walking to the front door. On the porch, the cold hit me full in the face, sharp and clean. The ridge stretched below, quiet and blameless. The wind tugged at the edges of my coat. They were using every trick I'd ever taught them, illusion framing repetition. I used to think control was about noise, about who shouted loudest, but real control was quieter, strategic, documented. Inside, my friends' laughter drifted faintly through the walls, soft and human. I looked out at the white valley snow swirling through the pines. I used to think I'd built a refuge. Now I realized I'd built a stage. The phone in my pocket buzzed once more. I pulled it out. A new message, from a number I didn't recognize. Hi, Clara. This is Jason Miles from the Oregon Ledger. We're hearing your family is selling their stake in Silverpine. Would you like to comment? I stared at the words, the irony too sharp to laugh at. My family didn't just want to invade my house. They wanted to rewrite ownership itself. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The snow thickened until the ridge vanished completely. All right, I whispered to no one. If it's a game they want, then it's time to play. Eleanor Hayes's office sat high above downtown Portland, all steel and glass and money. From the 33rd floor, the city looked small, like something that could be rearranged with the tip of a pen. Inside, everything smelled like cedar and control, suits, perfume, fresh ink. The meeting room was cold enough to make the windows fog slightly around the edges. I sat across from Eleanor and Sable Winters, my lawyer, the two women who, despite being on my side, felt like different kinds of storms. Eleanor in her tailored cream suit, all elegance and warning. Sable, in black, efficient and silent, her expression carved from stone. Eleanor was the first to speak. Clara, your family has caused reputational damage to the Silverpine project. Investors are calling. The rumor that your resort is a Whitmore family trust property has circulated through at least 3 major real estate forums. If we don't contain it, we'll lose the sustainability fund backing the next phase of development. Her tone was calm, but the message landed like a verdict. I'll handle it, I said steady, but not through statements or apologies. I'll handle it in the only language they ever respected, the language of contracts. Eleanor's brows lifted, not quite surprise, but approval tempered with caution. That's a sharp blade to draw, Ms. Whitmore. Make sure you don't cut yourself with it. I turned to Sable. What are our options? She opened her laptop, the glow washing her face in cold light. We've done some digging. Yesterday your family, or rather someone acting on their behalf, filed a preliminary document in Multnomah County Court. It's called a family trust transfer. The filing claims you under the name Clara M. Whitmore consented to transfer ownership of Silverpine Retreat LLC into the Whitmore Family Trust to ensure continuity of legacy assets. I stared at her. Clara M. Whitmore. She nodded. They've added a middle initial that doesn't exist. You've never used it in any legal capacity. The signature is an imitation. Close enough to fool someone at first glance, but wrong in structure. It's forgery. I felt the words settle in me like ice. My parents hadn't just crossed a line. They'd redrawn the map. I don't have a middle name, I said quietly. They invented one. A cleaner version of me. Someone compliant enough to sign away everything. Eleanor leaned forward, her nails tapping once against the polished table. They're trying to rewrite your identity. Control the narrative by creating a parallel you. If that story takes hold, you'll be the imposter. The irony twisted like a knife. They've been creating versions of me my whole life. This one just happens to have paperwork. Sable slid a folder across the table. Here's what we're going to do. We file a counter motion and a fraud claim simultaneously. We'll attach notarized documents proving your LLC ownership, your original tax filings, and a statement verifying the false signature. I've already prepared the draft. I flipped open the folder. The first page was a formal declaration stamped and formatted in legalese. It named them all Gregory Eleanor and Nathan Whitmore. The words intent to deceive and criminal forgery jumped out in bold type. Sable's voice was low but deliberate. This isn't just a civil dispute now. If the court accepts our evidence, the state can pursue it as a felony. Eleanor's gaze flicked between us. You're about to set a precedent, Clara. Once you make this public, there's no putting it back in the bottle. I looked at her. You're afraid the investors will run. I'm pragmatic, she replied smoothly. They like a clean image. Lawsuits don't photograph well. Sable interrupted without looking up from her notes. Truth does. Eleanor smiled faintly. Truth can be edited. I took the pen lying beside the folder. The weight of it felt like balance. Cold, exact. Then let's make sure it's written in ink. Sable turned the final page to the signature line. Here, I signed my name. No middle initial, no hesitation. The pen scratched across the paper final and alive. The sound echoed in the quiet like a declaration. When I set the pen down, Eleanor exhaled softly. You know, she said, her tone almost reflective in business silence, isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the most elegant form of power. The moment you speak, you give your opponent something to react to. When you stay silent, they fill in the blanks, and the blanks are where fear grows. Her words lingered longer than I expected. I nodded slowly. For most of my life, silence meant obedience. I think I finally understand. It can also mean strategy. Sable closed the folder with a sharp click. We'll file the counter motion and fraud complaint at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Once it's logged, they'll be served by noon. They won't know what hit them. Outside, the sky had turned from gray to deep violet, the city lights beginning to glow against the glass. Eleanor stood and extended a hand. Handle this cleanly, Clara. And remember, the quietest moves usually leave the deepest marks. I shook her hand. They'll learn that soon enough. Sable gathered her files, her expression unreadable. We'll reconvene once the filings are official. Stay alert tonight. If they try another move, document everything. Every message. Every call. I left the building just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Portland at night always smelled of wet concrete and electricity. The streets shimmered under the streetlights, the city humming below me. By the time I reached the car, my phone buzzed. A single notification from an unknown number. You're making a mistake, Clara. You don't know who you're fighting. No name, no punctuation. I stared at the message for a long time, then locked the screen and started the engine. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't know who I was fighting anymore. But for the first time, I knew exactly what I was fighting for. The headline hit like a strike of lightning on wet ground. The Whitmore family and the Silverpine scandal. It was printed in bold across the front page of the Oregon Chronicle, the photo below showing Silverpine Retreat bathed in morning mist, beautiful and incriminating. Beneath it, the subheading read, Forgery Family Betrayal and a Mountain Property at the Center of Oregon's Most Personal Legal War. I sat in my car outside a coffee shop on 10th Avenue, watching people walk past the newsstand, some pausing to read. Inside, the barista flipped through the paper between orders, shaking his head as if he'd stumbled on a true crime feature. My name was there in print, but for once not as a shadow in someone else's story. 3 weeks had passed since Sable filed the countersuit. The silence after had been deceptive, like a lull before an avalanche. Then the Chronicle picked up the filings from the county clerk's database and ran the story with every document attached to the forged trust transfer. The false middle initial, the timeline of deceit. By noon, it was everywhere. Twitter, Reddit, even LinkedIn. Hashtag Silverpine Retreat trended for hours. They called it the quietest revenge in Oregon real estate history. I didn't post. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. In another part of Portland, I imagined Eleanor sitting at her breakfast table, pearls still around her neck, holding the newspaper in her manicured hands. Her coffee probably went cold before she reached the end of the first paragraph. That afternoon, Sable called to confirm what I already suspected. Your father's been suspended by the Oregon Bar Association pending investigation, she said. Falsified documentation tied directly to his filings. I closed my eyes. And Nathan. She sighed. His firm terminated his contract this morning. They cited reputational harm and conflict of interest. You should also know your mother's charitable board quietly accepted her resignation. There it was. The empire of perfection dismantled not by noise, but by documentation. They once taught me that reputation was everything, that perception built empires and emotion was weakness. Maybe that was true. Maybe that's why this hurt them more than it ever could have hurt me. That evening, I drove to the courthouse for the final hearing. The building loomed gray and indifferent against the winter sky. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed above the rows of benches. My parents sat on the opposite side, faces drawn and pale, their attorney Henry Blackwell whispering furiously. He was an older man, slick and seasoned, the kind who believed every problem could be solved by phrasing. "Your Honor." He said, his tone calm but desperate. This was a misunderstanding within a family business. There was no malicious intent, only confusion over management rights. Sable rose without hesitation. With respect. "Your Honor, this is not a family disagreement. This is fraud. They forged a legal signature, fabricated a middle initial to create a false identity, and filed it with intent to claim assets they never owned." The courtroom went quiet, except for the faint shuffle of papers. The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. When the ruling came, it was swift and unequivocal. The court finds that Silverpine Retreat LLC is the sole property of Ms. Clara Whitmore. The forged document is null and void. The actions of the defendants constitute intentional misrepresentation and will be referred for further review. The gavel struck once, a sound that seemed to echo far beyond the courtroom walls. Outside, reporters waited in the cold cameras, glinting like frost. One of them, Rebecca Hart, a journalist I remembered from my agency days, stepped forward as I exited the courthouse. "Clara," she called out, breath visible in the winter air. "Do you have anything you'd like to say to your family?" I paused. The wind lifted the ends of my hair, and, for a heartbeat, I almost spoke. There were so many words I could have said, accusations, explanations, even pity, but none of them would have fit. I looked at her and simply said, "Silence is enough." The shutters clicked like falling snow. By evening, the internet had crowned me as both heroine and villain, depending on who was watching. Some praised my composure, others called me ruthless. It didn't matter. The truth was already sealed in public record, and the rest was just noise. That night back in Silverpine, I sat by the fire. The resort was finished now. Every wall, every light, every reflection of the valley below, exactly how I'd imagined. My phone buzzed once. A new message from Eleanor Hayes. "You won. Don't become them." I stared at the words for a long time before locking the screen. Winning didn't feel like triumph. It felt like quiet after thunder, thick, disorienting, full of debris. The wind howled outside, but inside the lodge, the only sound was the low hum of the fire. They'd spent their lives teaching me that silence was submission, that only noise could prove value. But here, surrounded by everything I'd built alone, I understood what they never would. Silence could also be justice, and justice didn't need to speak. It only needed to hold. Spring arrived in the Cascades the way forgiveness does. Quietly, almost invisible at first. The snow melted in slow ribbons down the ridge, revealing patches of green that had waited patiently all winter. The air smelled like pine and new beginnings. On the morning of Silverpine's opening, the sun rose over the valley, pale gold through a thin veil of mist. Strings of soft lights lined the wooden path that led to the main lodge. Guests mingled with glasses of wine and small plates of local food, their laughter low and contented. Music drifted from a trio on the deck, their notes soft enough not to disturb the silence that still lived in the trees. I stood near the entrance, watching the crowd move through the space I had built board by board. The lodge glowed warm against the cool air, stone, cedar, and glass woven together like a long exhale. A car pulled up along the gravel path, and a familiar figure stepped out. Nana Ruth, small but upright in her favorite navy coat. Her cane tapped lightly as I went to meet her. "Well," she said, eyes glinting behind her glasses, "look at you. I thought I was coming to see a house. You've built a whole peace treaty." I laughed and offered her my arm as we walked up the path together. The boards were smooth underfoot, the faint scent of cedar rising with each step. She paused halfway and looked out over the valley. "You didn't build walls, kiddo," she said softly. "You built calm." Her words caught somewhere in my chest. I squeezed her hand. "That was the plan. Plans change," she said with a small smile. "But peace is something you keep." We reached the deck where the guests were gathering. She sat down with a sigh of satisfaction, accepting a glass of apple cider from one of the servers. I stood beside her for a moment, letting the sound of conversation wash over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about defense or ownership. I was just here. Later that afternoon, as the crowd thinned, a woman approached the reception desk. She looked about 50, travel-worn but graceful, with careful eyes that didn't miss much. "Hi," she said. "I'm Mila Torres. I booked a weekend stay through the website." "Welcome to Silver Pine," I said, smiling. "I hope the drive wasn't too rough." She looked past me out toward the glass wall and the mountains beyond. It was long, but I needed the distance. Something in her tone made me pause. That night, after most guests had gone to their cabins, I found her sitting by the fire in the main lounge. She was staring into the flames, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "I came here to remember who I used to be," she said quietly when I sat beside her. "I left my husband last month. He wasn't violent, at least not in the way people mean when they say that, but he made me feel small for 20 years. I didn't realize I'd disappeared until I started packing." I nodded. "I know that kind of disappearing." She looked at me then, searching my face. "You do, don't you?" "I came here for the same reason," I said. "To remember that quiet can be something you own, not something that's forced on you." For a while, neither of us spoke. The fire popped softly, throwing small sparks against the grate. When she finally smiled, it was tentative but real. "Maybe quiet is where we start again," she said. "Maybe it's where we finally stop apologizing," I replied. The next morning she found me in the office, a small room off the main lodge where I handled bookings and paperwork. She hesitated in the doorway. "I'm thinking about staying in town," she said. "There's a little storefront on Main Street for rent. I used to bake, before all of it. I want to open a cafe." I looked up from my desk. "Do you have a name?" She thought for a moment. "Second Sunrise." I smiled. "That's perfect." By afternoon, we were at my desk again, filling out the paperwork for her small business loan application. I helped her organize the documents, notarize her statement of intent, and draft a proposal for the local economic grant. When she signed the final page, she looked lighter than when she'd arrived. "You're good at this," she said. "I've had practice rebuilding things I said." When she left for town the next day, I stood on the porch watching her car wind down the road. The name Second Sunrise stayed with me long after the sound of her tires faded. That evening, after the last of the guests had gone inside, I found a plain white envelope sitting on my desk. My name was written across it in my mother's handwriting. Neat, familiar, impossible to mistake. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of stationery embossed with her initials. The words were brief. "You got what you wanted, but you're still family." There was no signature, just that one line pressed deep enough into the paper that the ink had left a faint indentation. I folded the letter once, then again, and slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk. I didn't tear it up. I didn't frame it. I just left it there where the past belonged. Kept, but closed. Outside, the sky, over the ridge, had turned pale pink, the sun dipping low behind the pines. The wind carried the faint scent of melting snow and cedar sap. I sat for a while watching the light shift across the valley. I didn't need to erase them to move on. I only needed to stop leaving the door open behind me. The mountain was quiet again, not with isolation, but with peace. The kind that didn't ask for permission and didn't need to be explained. Snow began to fall again just after sunset, soft and soundless, blanketing the ridge in light. Inside the lodge, the fire crackled and cast a warm glow across the wood-paneled walls. It was New Year's Eve, the final night of a year that had remade me from the inside out. The rooms of Silverpine were full tonight. Friends, geese, people who had arrived in my life not through blood, but through choice. The kind of people who knocked before entering. The kind who stayed because they wanted to, not because they had to. Priya was by the fireplace laughing as Gabe tried to coax a tune out of the old upright piano we'd hauled up the mountain last spring. Sarah and Tom stood near the bar, refilling glasses, their faces lit by the amber reflection of the fire. Music played low and unhurried, something jazzy that fit the rhythm of the evening. I stood near the windows watching the snow swirl outside. The glass was cold under my fingertips. 12 years ago they told me I was too outstanding for the family image. They were right, but not in the way they thought. What they called arrogance was really clarity. What they saw as rebellion was just a refusal to stay small. I slipped on a white sweater soft and warm and stepped onto the balcony. The air hit me with its clean sharpness, and I breathed it in like a promise. Below the valley was a silver fog dotted with the faint glow of distant houses in town. The sound of laughter carried faintly through the glass behind me, low, alive, unbroken. Inside, Priya's voice rose above the hum. "Clara, you're missing the toast." "I'll be right there," I called back. But I didn't move yet. The world was still except for the snow. I could hear the wind against the pines, the soft thud of flakes against the railing. I closed my eyes for a moment, and another image surfaced. Me at 24 standing outside my parents' house in Lake Oswego, December of 2012. Snow then too heavier. The window glowed with light and laughter from a party I wasn't invited to. I remember standing at the edge of the driveway, staring at that closed door until the cold reached my bones. The memory flickered, then dissolved into the present. This same snow, but now I stood inside the warmth, the door locked behind me by choice, not by exclusion. The glass door slid open behind me, and Priya stepped out, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. "You okay?" she asked. I smiled. "Better than okay." She leaned against the railing beside me. "It's beautiful out here. You did it, you know. You built all this. Not alone," I said. She shrugged. "Still, you turned something broken into something solid. I think that's rare." Inside, Gabe threw another log into the fireplace, and sparks jumped briefly gold. "You've got a family now," Priya said softly. I turned to look through the glass at them. At Gabe's crooked grin, at Sarah clinking her glass against Tom's, at the warmth that filled the space I'd once thought would only echo. "Yeah," I said. "I do." When we went back inside, someone had opened another bottle of wine, and the piano was trying to keep up with laughter. We sat close around the fire, the air thick with cinnamon and pine. I didn't realize I was smiling until Gabe pointed at me. "Look at that," he said. "That's the face of someone who finally knows their home." Maybe he was right. As midnight neared, the crowd quieted. We counted down together, the laughter softening into anticipation. 10, 9, 8. Through the glass, fireworks began to bloom over the town below, faint flashes of gold and red painting the sky. 3, 2, 1. Cheers erupted. Glasses clinked. The sound of corks popping and music swelling filled the room. I stepped back toward the door again, drawn to the snow and the quiet. Outside, the fireworks reflected in the windows of the lodge, each burst mirrored in the glass. The sign near the gate glimmered under the lanterns. Silver Pine Retreat. Private Estate. I reached out and traced the cool metal letters with my fingertips. I hadn't built this place to prove anyone wrong. I'd built it to finally belong to myself. The snow fell heavier now, the world lit by both firelight and frost. For the first time I understood that peace wasn't the absence of noise. It was the ability to choose which voices you let in. From inside, I heard Gabe shout something about resolutions. Priya's laughter followed. The sound was warm enough to melt anything. I looked out at the valley one last time, my breath visible in the air. They once thought I was alone. They didn't know I had the law, the contracts, and people who believed in me. They didn't know that truth, once seen, can't be buried again. When the truth finally came to light, they just stood there, frozen in the shock of their own reflection. I turned back toward the light of the house, toward the laughter waiting for me inside. If you've ever been cut out of someone else's picture, take another one. Frame yourself in it, because light doesn't belong to those who fear it. It belongs to those who dare to stand in it.